Section 4.9 Emergent Benefits of Warfighting. What this generation needs is a war. Ives Klein Blue. As much as people hate to admit it, war has emergent benefits for society. A primary value-delivered function of warfare is to decentralize zero-trust and permissionless control over valuable resources in a systematically exogenous way that can't be systemically exploited or manipulated by people in high positions of rank. Thanks to more than 10,000 years of agrarian warfare, no person or polity has ever been able to gain full and unimpeachable control over the world's natural resources, no matter what they believe in and no matter how much abstract power they have consolidated. War has therefore acted as a great decentralizing force of human society that has successfully prevented the adoption of a single belief system which can be systemically exploited by an untrustworthy ruling class. The reason why this section and the preceding section devotes so much time towards thoroughly analyzing the dysfunctions of abstract power hierarchies and the complex emergent social benefits of warfare is to prep the reader for the core argument of this grounded theory, which is that Bitcoin represents a soft, as in non-kinetic, form of warfare that could be used to counteract the dysfunctions of software-aided abstract power hierarchies emerging in digital age society. Therefore, to understand the necessity and complex emergent benefits of power projection protocols like proof of work, it's necessary to understand the necessity and complex emergent benefits of warfare. As this section argues, they're effectively the same thing for most intents and purposes. The point of warfare is to decentralize abstract power and to preserve zero-trust and permissionless control over resources. And so is the purpose of proof-of-work protocols like Bitcoin. Section 4.9.1 To understand the complex benefits of proof-of-work, understand the complex benefits of war. Not surprisingly, this is a difficult topic to discuss. It would not be possible to present a theory about Bitcoin as a soft form of warfighting without a detailed exploration of the complex socio-technical benefits of warfighting. If the author's theory is valid that proof of work represents soft warfare, then the arguments provided in this section should simultaneously apply to Bitcoin. Here, the author will attempt to illustrate the similarities. While coding data for this grounded theory, the author discovered that the most common objection to the comparison between Bitcoin and warfare was due to an ideological objection to warfare rather than a logical objection. People don't like making logical comparisons between Bitcoin and warfare because they believe that warfare is ideologically bad. This objection was so common that the author felt it was necessary to dedicate a substantial amount of time thoroughly exploring this concept. As a result, this section is quite long, and in some cases repetitive, because of grounded theory's constant comparative method. So if the reader has no ideological objections to warfare, they are encouraged to move on after section 4.9.7. If the reader does have strong ideological objections to warfighting, or they strongly object to logical comparisons between proof-of-work protocols like Bitcoin and warfare, then they're encouraged to read this entire section to get a thorough breakdown of concepts which explain why it could be inappropriate to claim that warfare is objectively bad. There are many well-researched and well-documented complex emergent socio-technical benefits to warfare, namely the ability to secure the policies and properties that people value, that people ought to consider before they reject this theory for ideological reasons. By explaining some of the complex emergent social benefits of warfare, the author hopes that it will be easier for the reader to understand later discussions about what complex emergent benefits Bitcoin could bring to society as a soft or non-lethal form of warfare. Conversely, by explaining why it's questionably ethical to accuse warfare of being ideologically bad, the author hopes to make it easier to understand why it's questionably ethical to accuse proof-of-work technologies like Bitcoin of being ideologically bad. A common ideological objection to proof-of-work is that it's bad for the environment because of the amount of energy it uses. If the theory is valid that Bitcoin represents a soft form of warfare, then a valid counterargument against people who ideologically object to war could simultaneously function as a valid counterargument against people who ideologically object to proof-of-work technologies like Bitcoin. In other words, an effective argument against pacifism should double as an effective argument against those who oppose Bitcoin, in particular because of its energy usage. This section is therefore relevant to a discussion about Bitcoin, even though it might not appear to be on the surface. Such is an advantage of a grounded theory methodology, as it's explicitly designed to uncover these conceptual relationships in counterintuitive ways. A primary takeaway from this section is that rejecting proof of work because its energy usage is ostensibly bad for society is functionally the same argument that pacifists use to condemn warfare. If valid, this would not only suggest that anti-pacifism arguments double as pro-proof-of-work arguments, but it would also further reinforce the theory that Bitcoin is indeed a form of warfare. The fact that the arguments presented in this section align with Bitcoin's subject matter further validates the author's overarching theory that Bitcoin is indeed a new form of warfare that could dramatically impact how national strategic security is achieved in the digital age. Section 4.9.2 Wars remind humans that humans haven't outsmarted nature. War could be described as the byproduct of four flawed human assumptions. First, people assume that humans can be trusted the same at increasingly high scales of cooperation. Second, people believe that trustworthy people will remain trustworthy as they gain exponentially more abstract power and control authority within a given abstract power-based dominance hierarchy. Third, people believe they can sufficiently constrain other people from abusing their abstract power using logical constraints encoded into rules of law. Fourth, humans assume they are exceptions to nature, that there was ever a time where they didn't fight and kill for their resources. Humans continually fight and kill for their resources, but most people in modern polities outsource this ugly business to specialized workforces like militaries and butchers. For some reason, humans like to adopt belief systems where there's some kind of special exemption to nature. Because people are prone to making these faulty assumptions, they design and adopt trust-based and permission-based belief systems where they are neither protected by nor against the abstract power of their adopted ruling class. It should therefore come as no surprise that these belief systems are systemically insecure. In every abstract power hierarchy, the ruling class is physically powerless to defend their population against outside threats, and the ruled class is physically powerless to defend their polity against insider threats. For these reasons, abstract power hierarchies have a well-recorded history of being invaded or corrupted unless physical power, aka warfare, is used to compensate for these security flaws. Warfare is a recurring phenomenon because 1. The abstract power hierarchies created by human belief systems are routinely dysfunctional because they're so systemically insecure. And 2. There doesn't appear to have been a time in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth where it hasn't been necessary to project physical power to survive and prosper. War appears to be the activity which occurs after a population relearns the same lesson that abstract power-based dominance hierarchies are systemically insecure against invasion and corruption. War is essentially an act of capitulation when people who subscribed to a belief system tacitly admit to the flaws of their assumptions. During times of war, people implicitly confess that abstract power hierarchies are flawed because 1. People can't be trusted with abstract power, and 2. Encoded logic can't constrain people from abusing their abstract power. As much as they hate it, they have to use real power because their imagination alone isn't going to protect and defend them. War can be summarized as the act of domesticated sapiens rediscovering time and time again that there is no viable substitute for physical power, aka Watts, as the basis for settling their disputes, establishing control authority over their most precious resources, and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their property in a systemically secure way. War is the act of people admitting that trust-based, permission-based, and inegalitarian control authority over valuable resources gained by using abstract power hierarchies is not a viable substitute for the zero-trust, permissionless, and egalitarian control authority over valuable resources gained by using physical power. War is incontrovertible proof that dominance hierarchies based on abstract power do not sufficiently replace dominance hierarchies based on physical power. War proves that as much as humans like to play make-believe and pretend like they can break free of physics and nature and learn to settle their intraspecies resource disputes or establish their intraspecies pecking order using something other than physical power, they can't. War proves they can't, no matter how much thinking and design logic and imagination they try to throw at the problem. There is incontrovertibly no viable replacement for physical power as the basis for settling disputes and establishing pecking order. Section 4.9.3 Wars create zero trust and permissionless control over resources. A primary value-delivered function of warfighting is zero trust and permissionless control over valuable resources. War gives people a way to settle disputes, establish control authority over resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property in a way that does not require them to trust anyone or ask for anyone's permission. War gives agrarian society a way to manage their resources the same way wild animals already do. War is therefore an act of people behaving like the creatures they really are, wild animals, and one of the planet's most lethal apex predators. When people watch humans physically fighting each other, they watch the natural, undomesticated version of themselves. Not surprisingly, domesticated people find this activity to be repulsive and beneath them, just like they would probably find many other things in nature to be repulsive and beneath them. From their high tower far above the rest of the food chain, they forget how they got into that high tower. In these situations, war serves as a reminder that humans are still merely humans, that we still bite and claw and physically clash at each other to establish our interspecies dominance hierarchy, just like other wild pack animals must do so. Why? Chapter 3 already discussed why. Because Earth's resources are limited. The world is full of predators and entropy, and only the strongest and sharpest survive. War is a very humbling activity because it shows us that no matter how much we wish we could think our way out of solving the survivor's dilemma, and no matter how much we can imagine that we have transcended nature, humans are nevertheless helpless against physics, primordial economics, and natural selection. Section 4.9.4 War gives people the ability to resist systemic exploitation and abuse, aka belief system hackers. In 1503, Admiral Christopher Columbus landed near the north coast of what we now call Jamaica with a crippled fleet of merchant ships. When he arrived, native Jamaicans welcomed him and aided him. But over the following year, Columbus's crew were extremely abusive to their native hosts. They repeatedly stole from the natives, cheated them, raided them, and committed several other indiscretions, including rape and murder. Not surprisingly, the native Jamaicans responded by ceasing to provide aid. By 1504, Admiral Columbus's crew found themselves stranded on the shores of Jamaica and under threat of starvation. They could not leave because they did not have seaworthy ships, but they could not stay because they had an insufficient supply of food and were highly outnumbered by increasingly disgruntled natives. Desperate and danger close to starvation, Admiral Columbus did what many Europeans had already learned to do well. He used his literacy and storytelling skills to give himself abstract power. Thanks to his son's literacy in astronomy, Admiral Columbus was aware of an impending lunar eclipse. Armed with this knowledge, Columbus met with the native Jamaican chiefs and warned them that God would become so angry with the natives for not providing Columbus's crew with resources that God would destroy their moon. Having already been betrayed by Columbus, the Jamaican chiefs learned not to trust Admiral Columbus's crew, so they initially did not believe him. But in late February 1504, a total lunar eclipse of the moon occurred over the skies of Jamaica, just as the Admiral Columbus's son said it would. In his journal, his son describes what happened next. The Indians grew so frightened that with great howling and lamentation, they came running from all directions to the ships, laden with provisions, and praying the admiral to intercede with God, that he might not vent his wrath upon them, and promising they would diligently supply all their needs in the future. This story has several lessons which many domesticated people seem to forget. The core lesson is that people don't need an army to create and consolidate abstract power and use it to gain control authority over a population's valuable resources. They just need the population to have a belief system they can exploit. It is possible to inspire an entire population of people to bend to your will by barely lifting a finger. All it takes is a persuasive story. The God King playbook is extremely simple. Convince a population to adopt a common belief system, particularly a belief system which involves something or somebody with a lot of abstract power, and then exploit the population with it. For this reason, militaries have never been strictly necessary for the creation, consolidation, and expansion of abstract power and control authority over society's precious resources. Instead, militaries are necessary for a limited number of occasions where people refuse to believe in someone's abstract power, when they are strong enough, courageous enough, and aggressive enough to physically resist being exploited through a belief system. The purpose of this anecdote is to highlight a complex emergent social benefit of warfighting, which, domesticated, people unfortunately tend to overlook. When sapiens adopt abstract belief systems and ostensibly more peaceful ideologies as the basis for settling their intraspecies disputes and establishing their dominance hierarchy, they simultaneously adopt a belief system which can be molded, adjusted, and exploited. A clever foreigner can waltz right in and exploit these belief systems to give themselves the imaginary power of that belief system. On the contrary, when people use physical power as the basis for settling their disputes and establishing their dominance hierarchy, they adopt a system which is invulnerable to this type of attack. Aside from providing a zero-trust and permissionless way to control valuable resources, the physical power used in warfare is also beneficial because it doesn't create an exploitable dominance hierarchy. It doesn't give anyone the ability to define or redefine what good means or what right is. It doesn't place anybody with imaginary powers at the top of the pecking order. Instead, warfare lets physics and probability decide the pecking order. If Jamaican natives were more inclined to use physical power to establish their dominance hierarchy rather than subscribe to belief systems where entities with imaginary power were given dominance over them, they might not have been so easily manipulated by Admiral Columbus, someone who was in a very weak position at the time, and history might have played out differently for them. But instead, native Jamaicans literally fell to their knees and begged weak, helpless, starving oppressors for essentially no other reason than the fact that they had adopted a belief system where people with imaginary power have dominance over them. Here we illustrate an important socio-technical feature of warfare that many people overlook. The might is right pecking order heuristic for establishing intraspecies dominance hierarchies creates an amoral foundation which can't be exploited. Might is right could also be called physics is right. Wild animals which use physical power competitions to settle disputes and establish resource control authority, what we call warfare when our species performs the same activity, let physics and probability decide their pecking order for them. By using physics rather than abstract ideologies to determine the pecking order, wild animals don't suffer from the same vulnerability that sapiens routinely suffer from: population-scale psychological abuse and exploitation. Study a pack of wolves, and you'll notice that they spend a lot of time infighting, but they also don't suffer from abusive god kings or false prophets. Wolves may expend a lot of energy and risk a lot of injury establishing their pecking order, but they also don't fall to their knees and worship weak, helpless oppressors who abuse them. Wolves are mean, but they also don't allow themselves to be systemically exploited by their peers, who wield nothing but imaginary power, all because of unfalsifiable and continually changing beliefs about what good means, or what God wants. That's the socio-technical benefit of physical power-based dominance hierarchies. Species which choose to establish their pecking order using physical power competitions, what we call warfare, don't suffer from belief system exploitation. This concept is trivial to verify from our own experience, because we can see from our own historical testimony that populations which remain physically powerful and aggressive don't suffer god kings as gladly as weak or docile populations do. This principle is why the United States exists. Section 4.9.5 Wars decentralize control over vital agrarian resources. Zero trust, permissionless, and non-systemically exploitable control over resources are not the only socio-technical benefits of warfare. Another major benefit of warfare that people overlook, one that is extremely relevant to a discussion about Bitcoin, is decentralization of abstract power and control authority over resources. In addition to making a population more secure against psychological exploitation and abuse, warfighting also gives people the ability to physically constrain each other's abstract power and control authority. The ability to physically constrain abstract power represents the ability to physically decentralize abstract power hierarchies and its corresponding control authority over resources. In the author's experience performing research for this theory, this seems to be one of the most underappreciated socio-technical benefits of warfare. People don't seem to understand that one of the biggest advantages of warfighting is that it allows sapiens to decentralize abstract power and control authority over their valuable resources. Warfighting is the reason why there is no single, centralized ruling class over all the world's resources. Despite several attempts, nobody in history has ever been able to establish a single ruling class precisely because of the physical constraints caused by warfighting. This concept can be very counterintuitive to people, because many people, especially those who don't actually study or participate in warfare, have accused warfare of being a power consolidation mechanism rather than a power decentralization mechanism. These people will claim that warfare only gives people the ability to centralize their control authority and use it to oppress people. The reasoning often goes something like this. Kings raise armies and then utilize those armies in military campaigns to capture more resources. Therefore, militaries are centralizing forces because rulers build and use them to grow and consolidate their abstract power and control authority over resources. There are 3 problems with this line of reasoning. First, it makes no distinction between physical power and abstract power. People who make this argument treat physical power and abstract power as if they're one and the same thing, when they're clearly not the same. Why do they make this false correlation between abstract power and real power? We have already discussed one reason why: the logical fallacy of hypostatization. People don't think about how they think about power. A second problem with this line of reasoning is that it relies on linear chain-of-event thinking rather than systems thinking. People who adopt this line of reasoning effectively blame the military for the king's consolidation of abstract power for no other reason than the fact that a military campaign happened to be the most recent, or easiest to observe, thing in a linear chain of events preceding the consolidation or expansion of the king's abstract power. In other words, they're tacitly implying a direct causal relationship between military campaign and consolidation of power simply because of a temporal relationship, while willfully ignoring other explanations that could equally explain why the king's power has been consolidated. It's not uncommon for wars to break out in addition to other factors like disease or famine or other disruptive factors which happen at the same time and could just as easily explain how a person could consolidate abstract power. Another perfectly valid explanation for why a king has more consolidated power following a military campaign is simply because more people choose to believe in the king's abstract power for reasons separate from, but temporarily correlated to, the military campaign. A third problem with this line of reasoning is that it willfully ignores the fact that physical power has never been strictly necessary to create, codify, or consolidate abstract power and control authority over resources. This reasoning essentially ignores the lesson which Admiral Columbus and so many others have demonstrated throughout history. All that is required to create, codify, and consolidate abstract power and control authority over people's resources is for people to adopt a common belief system. As countless ideological movements have demonstrated across thousands of years, militaries are unnecessary for the consolidation of abstract power. Clearly, warfighting is used to constrain and decentralize ideological movements that consolidate abstract power too much for people's liking, hence religious wars. There is nothing physically limiting a person or regime from convincing a population to adopt an ideological belief system, for example a monetary system or a religion, which expands worldwide, then consolidates and centralizes abstract power and control authority over everyone's resources. Except, of course, for one thing: real power. Herein lies a key insight into warfighting which so many civilians tragically miss. Warfighting is one of the main activities preventing agrarian society from a single, consolidated, centralized belief system which could be systematically exploited by a single ruling class. There is no one world government because societies are willing to fight wars to prevent that other government from becoming their government. If you ever feel like you're being oppressed, then take a look around. There is a high probability that you either 1. Have chosen to adopt an exploitable belief system, 2. You're not strong enough or willing to physically fight to secure yourself against oppression, or 3. Some combination of both. We have established that God Kings don't need physical power to oppress you. All they need is for you to 1. Adopt ideologies which give them abusable imaginary power, and 2. Be too weak or docile to physically resist them. So if you feel like you're being oppressed, it's likely because you have adopted a belief system that is being exploited, combined with the fact that you're too weak, scared, docile, or ineffectual to physically secure yourself the way all animals in nature do. It's an impolite but valid argument. With these concepts in mind, let's consider what prevents an oppressive God King from taking over the world and exploiting everyone at global scale. People's ideologies and desire for non-physical dispute resolution clearly motivate them to adopt exploitable belief systems. So what remains as the final line of defense for the global consolidation of abstract power are the fighters. There is a tiny subset of the global human population who remains unwilling to forfeit their physical power, or who remain unsympathetic to abstract, exploitable belief systems, which are so very clearly flawed. These people are the only ones left in our global society who have the physical strength and aggression required to preserve our species' physical, power-based dominance hierarchy. They spend the energy and risk the injury needed to settle disputes, preserve globally decentralized control over resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and property the way so few of us are willing to do. This tiny subset of people, less than 2% of the global human population, are warfighters who represent the last people standing in the way of one ruling class gaining consolidated and unimpeachable abstract power over everyone. Warfare is the reason why control over our valuable resources remains decentralized. Removing this global-scale physical power competition would remove the complex emergent benefit of decentralized control authority over our resources. In other words, warfare is one of the few things physically preventing abstract power and control authority over Earth's resources from being completely consolidated by one ruling class. So it is absolutely not valid to make the claim that warfare consolidates abstract power, because it's actually one of the largest physical barriers preventing the consolidation of abstract power. Section 4.9.6. For many intents and purposes, war functions as a proof-of-work protocol. Why have sapiens fought and died by the millions over thousands of years? One answer is so they don't have to suffer from the oppression of a ruling class they know they cannot trust. Warfighting could just as easily be described as a more than 10,000-year struggle to prevent global consolidation of abstract power and control authority over valuable resources. Sapiens have demonstrated very clearly that they would sooner risk nuclear annihilation than adopt a single ruling class. In fact, in every example of history where an emerging ruling class has attempted to gain too much abstract power and control authority over the world's natural resources, or have tried to consolidate everyone under a single empire, society has responded with massive-scale wars, utilizing physical power as the mechanism for adjusting the difficulty of achieving that much control. In other words, warfighting is functionally identical to Bitcoin's proof-of-work protocol. By participating in a highly energy-intensive, global-scale physical power competition, agrarian society enjoys the complex emergent benefit of decentralized control over their resources. When a population goes to war, they accept the energy expenditure and risk of injury required to keep themselves secure against the centralization of abstract power. Of course, it would be far more efficient, in time, energy, money, and lives, to have a single ruling class settle all property disputes, manage all the resources, and decide the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of all the property. But that would be a systematically insecure solution that is highly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse by the ruling class. This type of system would require one moral code and one moral authority, which everyone would have to trust in and tacitly receive permission and approval from. No matter how much people like to virtue signal to their peers about how much they condemn physical aggression, they demonstrate through their actions that they are very well aware of this attack vector. If people truly believed that peaceful adjudication methods could be used to settle all disputes and manage all resources, then people would achieve consensus on a single belief system where a single ruling class settles all disputes and manages all resources across the world. People clearly don't behave like this. They go through great lengths, spending extraordinary amounts of time and energy, and risking an extraordinary amount of personal injury, explicitly to prevent people from unifying under a common belief system. Through their actions, not their words, people demonstrate that they instinctively understand that warfare has irreplaceable social benefits, no matter how desperately they wish it didn't. If societies didn't have something to gain from war, there wouldn't be war. We know from the bones we dig up, from thousands of years of written testimony, and from our own experiences, that people absolutely cannot be trusted with too much abstract power and control authority over us. It's simply too dangerous to give one person or one ruling class too much abstract power and control authority over any form of resource. So what do? We fight wars. We engage in global-scale physical power competitions to ensure that nobody can have too much abstract power and control over our resources. We fight to protect ourselves against the expansion of belief systems which we know are vulnerable to systemic exploitation. We fight to make sure our beliefs are adopted rather than their beliefs, because we don't trust theirs, or because we feel like the devil we know is preferable to the devil we don't know. Through our combined actions and behaviors, we show that we are just as wild, brutal, and unsophisticated as the animals we look down upon, no matter how much we like to wear our little lapel pins and masquerade like we're above it. Without being able to physically constrain the expansion of abstract power, there would be nothing physically preventing abstract power from spreading worldwide. Warfare gives our species an opportunity to overthrow or delegitimize abstract power when it becomes exploitative or abusive. With the ability to physically constrain and delegitimize abstract power comes the ability to physically decentralize control authority. Proof of this complex emergent behavior can easily be verified by simply noting how our species chooses to partition its territory. The reason why the dry surface area of the Earth has been partitioned across 195 different countries is largely the result of wars fought to decentralize those territories. If warfighting can decentralize our control authority over land, then it stands to reason that it can decentralize our control authority over other assets too, including digital resources like bits of information. The question is really about how it might be done, not if it could be done. Therein lies the strategic significance of Bitcoin. Section 4.9.7 Warfighting is a safety feature, not a bug. Another way to think about the complex emergent social benefit of warfare is to think about fire safety. Fire safety engineers design special doors called fire doors. Fire doors improve building safety because they can contain and isolate fires in specific parts of a building to prevent them from spreading or to slow their expansion down. With this concept in mind, consider the function of national borders. National borders are forged by warfare and have essentially the same safety features as fire doors. When an abstract power hierarchy becomes hazardous, for example, oppressive, national borders make it possible to contain or isolate this hazard to a specific region of the world and to prevent it from spreading. Thanks to national borders, exploitative and abusive abstract power hierarchies remain contained. So long as a population can do a good job at securing their own borders, then the only threat of oppression they have to worry about is oppression from their own ruling class. And so long as our species continues to do a good job at warfighting, to divide control authority over our valuable physical resources, we can minimize the amount of damage that could be caused by a single oppressive ruling class. In other words, warfare is a safety feature, not a bug. It protects humans from themselves, particularly their exploitable belief systems. It prevents the spread of hazardous belief systems by physically constraining and containing them. Section 4.9.8 War is the exact same primordial game that all organisms play, but given a different name. In addition to helping sapiens protect themselves against the hazards of their own abstract belief systems, it could be argued that warfighting has the same upsides as predation in nature. When sapiens engage in warfare, they engage in the same physical power projection activity other living organisms have engaged in for 4 billion years. It is therefore reasonable to believe that warfare could also produce the same complex emergent benefits that physical power projection competitions provide to all species, namely the ability to re-vector resources to those who are the strongest, most intelligent, and most capable of adapting to their environment, and therefore more capable of surviving in a world filled with predators and entropy. The explanation for why sapiens are so prone to warfighting could be the same explanation for practically everything else we observe in nature. What we see is what survives. There appears to have been many human polities over the past 10,000 years which didn't raise militaries and didn't go to war. We know these societies existed because we can find and dig up their mass graves to see how early and unpleasantly they died. It's not the case that peace-loving societies didn't exist. It's the case that peace-loving societies didn't survive. If we account for our survivorship bias, in other words, account for the fact that what we observe, including ourselves, went through a very rigorous selection process, which weeded out a lot of other possibilities, then we can reframe a question about why sapiens fight wars in a way that's much easier to answer. Why do societies believe they will be able to survive without warfighting? Or to put it differently, what gives humans the impression that they are the only animals in nature who have an inherent right to live peacefully without predators? Admittedly, survival of the fittest is an unsatisfying explanation for warfare. Like eating a head of lettuce, this explanation is neither salty nor sugary. It's a stoic explanation. It just is. It's neither a profound nor a romantic way to think about war. It's an amoral one, which accepts physical conflict as a natural behavior. This point of view does nothing to justify or reconcile the cruelty and bloodshed we see in war, nor how angry it makes us feel. And frankly, it's boring, not to mention super annoying, to be reminded of the fact that sapiens are just as ordinary and unremarkable as the wild animals we look down upon and believe we have outsmarted. It's also quite frustrating to think that despite how bulbous our foreheads are, we have not found a way to outsmart natural selection, except only in our imaginations. Nevertheless, here we are, growling, snarling, scratching, snapping and biting at each other over food and territory, no different than a pack of wolves or wildcats. The only difference seems to be the abstract thoughts filling our bulbous heads with reasons to justify or condemn our physical aggression. War is the same power projection game we can all independently observe in nature, just with a different name. Instead of primordial economics, people call it war. Instead of the survivor's dilemma, people call it national strategic security. Whatever names people choose to assign to these phenomena and whatever fancy uniforms they like to wear while they wage it, the first principles explanation of warfare remains the same. Hence why it's called a first principles explanation. Sapiens are one of thousands of other species of pack animals playing the same primordial game, using physical power to establish their dominance hierarchy just like the rest. While perhaps not as emotionally satisfying as other pontifications about warfare, the previous chapter about power projection in nature can at least give the reader an appreciation of why and how warfare works without complicating our understanding of the matter with abstract and unfalsifiable ideologies. War can easily be explained using basic principles in physics and biology. If we can wrap our heads around the complex emergent benefits of power projection in nature, then we should be able to understand the complex emergent benefits of warfare, despite how many other abstract explanations people and their bulbous foreheads have come up with over the last several thousand years. Section 4.9.9 War highlights lessons learned about survival and countervailing entropy. As discussed in the beginning of this chapter, we live with the immense burden of being prisoners trapped behind our own prefrontal cortices. We cannot see or experience the world as it is. We can only experience a version of the world that has been filtered through a minefield of emotionally charged abstract thoughts and symbolism. Like looking through a pair of rose-tinted glasses, sapiens look at the world through ideology-tainted glasses. This makes it very difficult to present arguments about the benefits of warfare on society without it being complicated by abstract ideas like ethics, morals, theologies, or modern politics. The solution? Simply don't call it warfare. Call it something else, like primordial economics. In case it wasn't already clear to the reader, the previous chapter about power projection tactics in nature was a clandestine attempt to get the reader to understand and appreciate the necessity and complex emergent social benefits of warfighting. These benefits are backed by science and lots of independently validated empirical evidence with naturally occurring datasets that can be analyzed ex post facto for causal inference. Like most clandestine operations, an argument about why warfighting is good for society must be presented to people in this manner because it is a highly illicit activity. It goes against social custom to explain why warfare is good for society. To circumnavigate conflicting ideologies regarding warfare, the author provided a detailed argument for the emergent benefit of warfare without calling it warfare. Just by changing the name of the activity and using non-human examples, like the origin story of birds and mammals, it's possible to provide a logical, first principles, grounded theory about the necessity and merit of warfare that is backed by science and loads of empirical evidence. As a refresher, the logic presented in the previous chapter was as follows. Power projection competitions give life an accelerated existential imperative to innovate, self-optimize, and vector limited resources to organisms which are demonstrably more fit for survival in a congested, contested, competitive, and hostile environment, an environment they don't have the option of escaping. Physical power projection competitions and predation have a causally inferable tendency to make life stronger, more organized, more intelligent, more adaptable, and thus more capable of countervailing the entropy of the universe. If the reader understands this logic, then they should be able to understand why it's reasonable to believe that warfighting provides the same complex emergent benefits to humans too. War is effectively the same power projection game with a different name, so it stands to reason that warfare would have the same complex emergent properties for humans as it would for other organisms. We can validate from our own experiences that warfare appears to give society the ability to self-optimize and ensure their limited resources are vectored towards the subset of the population who are more fit to survive in congested, contested, competitive, and hostile environments. Warfare clearly appears to help society become more capable of countervailing the entropy of the universe. We have no shortage of empirical evidence to back this theory. We see it practically everywhere on and off Earth. Section 4.9.10. The first moonwalkers were not just explorers. They were the world's apex predators. The first earthen life to escape Earth and walk on the surface of another heavenly body were sapiens, Earth's peak predator. The population of sapiens which walked on the moon was the population which devoted itself to mastering the challenge of warfighting. Moonwalkers weren't just any sapiens. They were sapiens from the world's most powerful military nation who got there by riding an oversized version of nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles partially designed by Nazi scientists and engineers. NASA's director and chief engineer for the Saturn V program were Nazi rocket scientists and engineers ushered into the U.S. without public scrutiny via a secret intelligence program known as Operation Paperclip. Once humans made it to the moon and started walking around on its surface, the first semantically and syntactically complex language they spoke were English words. They didn't just speak any random language. They spoke the acrolect of a United Kingdom which had just spent several preceding centuries conquering and colonizing the planet through several aggressive campaigns, to include one which successfully established a beachhead in North America, the place from which the humans who walked on the moon launched. And where did these moonwalkers get the calories they needed to do all that walking and talking on the moon? They got their calories from freeze-dried vegetables grown from fields plowed by the oxen they entrapped and enslaved. Freeze-dried beef from the cattle they domesticated and slaughtered over thousands of years. The point is, there are obviously some complex emergent benefits of warfighting when it comes to countervailing the entropy of the universe. The first moonwalkers weren't just our species' top explorers. They were our species' most powerful and aggressive power projectors. In fact, they were arguably life's most powerful and aggressive apex predator. The Apollo campaign was a thinly veiled effort to raise public funding and support for the research and development of the critical enabling military technology needed to remain strategically competitive with the USSR at a time when public support of the military was at an all-time low. The entire campaign happened during the Vietnam War and a pacifist movement. In the face of growing pacifism caused by discontent of an ongoing war, how do you convince the American public to send lots of public money to newly patrioted Nazi scientists and engineers to develop better intercontinental and cislunar nuclear missiles? Simple. Swap nuclear warheads with astronauts and pump funding into a different marketing strategy which put lots of imagery of it on TV with inspiring narratives about peace and exploration. With this simple sleight of hand, a workforce will have little to no reservation devoting substantial amounts of their time, technical talent, and public resources towards the development of strategic military assets. As the author has attempted to demonstrate, all one must do to circumvent a domesticated population's negative opinions about warfighting is simply to call it something other than warfighting. Call it primordial economics, call it space exploration, or perhaps call it a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Simply change the branding and people will have no problem pumping boatloads of money into the same technologies with the same functional use cases with little to no reservations. Look around and we can see similar evidence of the emergent benefits of warfighting everywhere. The organizations which master warfare have a clear tendency to become technological and economic leaders and general-purpose masters of their natural environment. This is not political dogma. This is an independently verifiable observation backed by 4 billion years' worth of empirical data. There is a lot of supporting evidence to feel concerned about populations who condemn war and refuse to fight it. We don't need a theory to explain the benefits of warfare. We just need to look around us. Like physical power, warfighting is proof of its own merit. We admire the footprints on the moon left behind by those who master warfighting. We dig up the mass, early graves left behind by those who don't master warfighting. Primordial economics, the survivor's dilemma, and the innovate or die and cooperate or die dynamics of predation are clearly at play for sapiens just as they are for all other species. If an intellectually honest reader can acknowledge there's merit to this line of reasoning, then they should understand the argument for why there are very important, complex emergent social benefits to warfighting that we have a logical, moral, and most importantly, an existential responsibility not to ignore. We must be willing to entertain an uncomfortable but potentially valid hypothesis that wars provide an irreplaceable social and technical benefit to humanity. The self-inflicted stress of predation and global power competitions have clearly made life more prepared to survive and prosper against the universe-inflicted stress of entropy. The technical systemic benefits of predation wouldn't change just because sapiens arbitrarily named this primordial behavior war. The dynamics of physical power projection don't change just because sapiens levy abstract thinking to produce moral, ethical, and theological justifications or explanations for it. Morals, ethics, and theologies are not first principles explanations backed by empirical evidence or scientific rigor. A first principles explanation of warfare backed by empirical evidence is that all living organisms physically battle each other over resources and have clearly experienced major systemic benefits from those battles, like becoming organized, powerful, and resourceful enough to survive devastating existential threats like meteor strikes. Since the emergence of primordial life, the act of living has been fundamentally an act of physical power projection to countervail a cold, harsh, unforgiving, and unwelcoming universe filled with predators and entropy. This didn't change just because sapiens grew overclocked, overpowered, oversized neocortices capable of thinking abstract, imaginary worlds where this isn't incontrovertibly true. The human capacity to believe in unicorns doesn't make unicorns physically real, and neither does the human capacity to believe in peaceful, alternative forms of physical power as a basis for settling disputes and establishing their dominance hierarchy. At least when people choose to believe in unicorns, they don't make themselves systemically vulnerable to foreign invaders or to population-scale systemic exploitation, unless you count the unicorn symbolizing the purity and the power of the British monarchy. It is simply not logical to believe that sapiens are exceptions to these principles, especially when there is so much empirical evidence backing it. It seems like it would be far harder to make the argument that it was confounding effects, correlation, or pure coincidence that the first earthen life to walk on the moon were English-speaking Americans riding on top of the missiles they had originally developed to kill each other. The much simpler explanation backed by first principles logic and highly randomized, causally inferable empirical evidence is the same reason Americans were the first to walk on the moon, is the same reason lions are ostensibly the king of the jungle. Technically speaking, tigers are the king of the jungle, if you don't include fire-wielding sapiens. Perhaps it is difficult to appreciate the complex emergent benefits of warfare because sapiens desperately want to believe there aren't predators or that they have somehow transcended the cruelties of survival in nature. People like to imagine that they have discovered an equally effective basis for settling disputes, establishing control authority over resources, achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property, or otherwise just solving the existential imperative all animals face of establishing pecking order over limited resources. So what do they do? We have already discussed what they do. They adopt abstract belief systems where people have imaginary power, and then they literally put on costumes and LARP as people with imaginary power to settle their disputes. Most pack animals use physical power to settle disputes, establish control authority over resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property. This is both an intraspecial and interspecial protocol that is 20,000 times older than anatomically modern sapiens and 80,000 times older than behaviorally modern sapiens who have tried, and so far been unsuccessful, to create alternative protocols for managing resources which doesn't rely upon physical power, alternatives which utilize imaginary power and are incontrovertibly and demonstrably dysfunctional. Despite how much sapiens wish they could escape the energy expenditure and injury risk associated with warfare, 5,000 years of written testimony, plus another 5,000 years of agrarian fossil records, indicate sapiens have very clearly never found a satisfactory substitute for physical power as the basis for settling disputes and establishing dominance hierarchies. All life forms owe their existence to the process of leveraging physical power to capture and secure their resources. Humans are no different. Humans don't negotiate for their oxygen. They capture it using physical power. Humans don't negotiate for the food they eat. They capture it using physical power, and then negotiate with each other over price. Humans don't negotiate for the land they occupied. They capture it from nature using physical power, and then negotiate with each other over price. It's incontrovertibly true that living organisms gain and maintain access to their resources using physical power. To live is to project physical power to capture and secure one's control over resources. This isn't something to condemn. It's something to devote oneself to studying and mastering. Section 4.9.11 A sign of peak predation is the hubris to believe that one has transcended the threat of predation. Does natural selection condemn physical power projection as morally, ethically, or theologically bad? No, it does the exact opposite. It asymmetrically rewards this behavior with more resources and the enormous privilege of survival. Take a look around, and the reader will likely note that the only animals condemning the use of physical power to establish intraspecies dominance hierarchies are sapiens. And they're probably not using a technical justification. They're probably using subjective, abstract reasoning and unfalsifiable claims about good or God. Like Dave Chappelle's fictional character, Clayton Bigsby, a passionate member of an anti-African American hate group who is blind and therefore incapable of seeing he's African American, pacifism is comedically ironic. Pacifists turn a blind eye to their own nature. They carry the genes of thousands of generations of predators who scorched the world and slaughtered their way to the top of the food chain. They are the children of their ancestors' conquest, so comfortable and complacent in their homes they built over the graves of the conquered that they forget their own heritage. They forget they're the colonialists, conquerors, and peak predators, benefiting directly from the activity they condemn. It's not surprising why modern domesticated sapiens can develop distorted or misattributed views. Sapiens have become so high on the food chain that many eat thousands of animals without killing a single one. They have mastered predation and killing to a point where they have turned it into a subscription service. They outsource their predation services so effectively that they forget they're predators, and they get upset, even horrified, when they're reminded about what they're paying for. Modern domesticated sapiens devour their meals sitting in cushioned seats, watching mentally cushioned videos of wildlife that has the cruelest and most brutal parts carefully edited out so the video better aligns with the inspiring music and narration given by some guy with an English accent. Sapiens crave stories told by storytellers, especially when they are told by wise old shamans who help them reconcile the mysteries and cruelty of nature. And they do it all from the comfort of well-insulated, air-conditioned rooms with entrapped and genetically deformed wolves and wildcats licking their feet and worshipping them. Modern domesticated sapiens sincerely and unironically believe they understand nature and have transcended the threat of predation. They genuinely think they have discovered a viable alternative to physical power projection, that they outsmarted natural selection. Ironically, there is probably no greater sign of peak predation than the extraordinary amount of hubris required to believe that one has transcended predation. The fact that people get so upset when they are reminded where their steak comes from doubles as proof of their extraordinary success at predation. They prey upon animals without even thinking about it. They scorch the world, colonize it, conquer it, and kill off their competitors so effectively that they forget how they came to own the land they're living on and morally defending in the first place. These same concepts apply to warfare. Sapient populations can become so good at warfare that they develop the hubris to believe they have transcended warfare. This is a common problem in system safety too. Success at safety breeds complacency. As a simple illustration of the point, the reader is invited to study every moral, ethical, or theological argument condemning warfare. Make a list containing the countries of origin from which those arguments were made, and then compare that list to a list of countries with the most dominant militaries. Don't just do linear regression to see correlations. Do other techniques like propensity score matching to determine if there are causally inferable relationships. Build predictive models on that data and run the model against history to see how accurately it can predict where wars are fought and won. When similar techniques have been tried by anthropologists, they find that their models are strikingly accurate. Several anthropologists have committed themselves to research which causally links the most prosperous, organized, cooperative, resource-abundant societies which enjoy the most amount of art and literature and social freedom to the most warring societies. Section 4.9.12 Peace depends upon demonstrably flawed assumptions about predatory human behavior. Another way to describe the sapient desire for peace is that it's fundamentally a desire for an end to predation. This desire appears to have spontaneously emerged after our species preyed on enough neighboring organisms to place ourselves comfortably at the top of the food chain. But is it realistic to expect predation to end? Given the socio-technical benefits outlined thus far, is it even a good idea to desire an end to predation? The innovate or die and cooperate or die dynamics which emerge from predation clearly benefit life's ability to countervail entropy. It's no secret that many of the most revolutionary technologies developed by humankind over the past 10,000 years emerged from their military conflicts against each other. In other words, human-on-human predation. It is also no secret that the existential threat of warfare motivates sapiens to cooperate at scales which dwarf the levels of cooperation shown by other species. Even if we ignore the systemic benefits of warfighting, it remains true that unrealistic design assumptions must be met for alternative approaches to physical power to function properly as a mechanism to settle sapient disputes, establish control authority over sapient resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of sapient property. When high levels of sympathy, trust, and cooperation exist within a sapient population, then abstract power hierarchies seem to be able to function nicely as an alternative to warfare. But given a large enough population over a long enough time span, it's hard to believe that these conditions can be permanently satisfied well enough to prevent them from becoming dysfunctional. Consider how much of the population needs to be untrustworthy for modern abstract power hierarchies to become dysfunctional. We can use the United States to serve as a better case scenario of an abstract power hierarchy which has a lot of checks and balances. In other words, logical constraints encoded into rules of law, to logically constrain the exploitation and abuse of abstract power. The United States is one of many presidential republics with a fully independent legislature, supposedly capable of preventing the consolidation and abuse of abstract power. But with 535 members of Congress representing the will of 336 million Americans, it would only take 0.00008% of the U.S. population, the president plus 51% of its legislature, to be dishonest or incompetent with their imaginary power for the United States to degenerate into unimpeachable population-scale exploitation and abuse of abstract power. The reader is invited to ask themselves, how responsible is it to entrust 0.00008% of the population with abstract power and control authority over the remaining 99.9999%? Combining this observation with the core concepts presented previously, here's another way to frame the same point. Because of our desire not to use physical power to establish our dominance hierarchy, people adopt belief systems like presidential republics that can be exploited and abused even when 99.9999% of the population is competent and trustworthy. With the exception of extremely limited, but revocable, privileges provided to citizens by the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. abstract power hierarchy relies on trust in people with imaginary power to manage their resources and keep them secure against high-ranking members of the population, wielding enormously asymmetric levels of abstract power and control authority over them that they clearly have incentives to exploit it. 99.9999% of the population must trust that 0.00008% of the population will be clever, competent, and honest enough with their abstract power for the U.S. presidential republic to function properly as a viable substitute for physical power as the basis for settling their disputes and establishing pecking order over their resources. Again, the U.S. was chosen because it represents a better case scenario. Many abstract power hierarchies would be even easier to systemically exploit than the U.S. presidential republic. It is clearly unrealistic to expect 0.00008% of the population to be clever, competent, and trustworthy with abstract power all of the time. Most citizens intuitively understand that the imaginary power and control authority we give to our politicians represents a major attack vector which is practically guaranteed to be systemically exploited and abused eventually, just as 5,000 years of written testimony tells us they have been exploited and abused in the past. There's a reason why the word politician is often considered to be a pejorative term. Citizens certainly recognize the risk of exploitation and abuse of abstract power. They are simply willing to accept the risk of exploitation and even to tolerate a certain threshold of it in exchange for not having to expend energy or risk injury settling their disputes, managing resources, and establishing pecking order using real-world physical power. In other words, we put up with it because we know that fighting to settle our disputes and establishing our dominance hierarchies would be time-intensive, energy-intensive, and destructive. We citizens agree to take part in a semi-consensual imaginary structure to give us a temporary reprieve from settling disputes, capturing and securing resources, and establishing pecking order the way natural selection demands from all species. We put up with the reoccurring flaws and the dysfunctional behaviors of our rules of law. We acknowledge the tendency for politicians everywhere, both in our abstract power hierarchies and in our neighbors' abstract power hierarchies, to be untrustworthy with their rank, and we put up with it because we don't want to have to fight each other to settle our disputes and establish our pecking order the way wild animals do. At least subconsciously, it appears that many people seem to intuitively understand how the alternative to abstract power is physical power. Section 4.9.13. Peace has only been a temporary reprieve from war, not a permanent replacement to war. Like the lunar eclipse enjoyed by Admiral Columbus, the temporary and fleeting moments of reprieve that sapiens get from the cruelty of predation are both beautiful and awe-inspiring. Unfortunately, both our primordial nature and our written history indicate that these moments are an exception, not a rule. Peace appears to be a reprieve from war, not a replacement for it. Sapiens can be thankful they get to experience these reprieves on special occasions, when exactly the right conditions align in exactly the right way. But it is clearly not reasonable for them to expect it to last forever. We can see that abstract power hierarchies can indeed function properly in a narrow subset of cases where populations can reasonably expect the ruling class to use their imaginary powers effectively. Sapiens have proven that it's possible to use imaginary power to satisfactorily settle disputes, establish control authority over resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their property. They have proven that it's possible to use their imaginations, abstract thinking skills, and design logic to cushion and insulate themselves from a cold, hard reality filled with predators and entropy. They can establish a pecking order in a way that doesn't expend energy or risk injury like physical power does. The problem is, of course, that imaginary power is just that, imaginary. It doesn't physically exist. Humans are playing make-believe. They only think they've found a viable replacement to physical power as the basis for establishing their dominance hierarchy. The ability to use imaginary power as a surrogate to real power is a story, an inspiring message that people are eager to believe in because it's hard for humans to emotionally reconcile how cold, cruel, and unsympathetic the laws of nature and survivorship truly are. These stories help us mentally escape from what could be the most difficult part of life to reconcile, the fact that we're the cruelest and most unforgiving peak predators of them all. But the reality is undeniable. We're constantly at war. Study enough nature and read enough history, and it becomes easy to see why some people argue that war is the rule and peace is merely a temporary exception. Crack open a history book or look at a teaspoon of ocean water under a microscope to see evidence of this assertion on your own. Like life itself, agrarian society has always been at war. It has always been projecting physical power to capture and secure access to resources. Society has always been fighting to decentralize control over resources to maximize its chances of survival. Based on what we can independently observe, war appears to be a continuous and cyclical process that takes place because agrarian society has yet to discover a sufficient alternative to settling their disputes, establishing control authority over their resources, and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their property. They attempt to use abstract power-based dominance hierarchies rather than physical power-based dominance hierarchies, but it clearly doesn't work. Our species is continuously fighting on a global scale. It's one of our predominant behaviors. Section 4.9.14. It might be immoral to claim that war is immoral. The common argument against pacifism. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Leon Trotsky. One of the most successful military commanders of all time was a son-in-law descendant of Genghis Khan, Timur the Great. Generally undefeated in battle, it is estimated that 5% of the global human population were killed during the 14th century Timurid conquests and invasions. During the establishment of the Timurid Empire, some cities fell so quickly that Timurid armies didn't even need to kill their contenders or haul their bodies to the graves. In some cases, the conquered would dig their own mass graves and then be buried in them while still alive. The Timurid conquests serve as one of many examples in history illustrating a fundamental flaw with pacifism. Pacifists literally dig their own graves. According to the Oxford Dictionary, pacifism is a belief that war is unjustifiable under any circumstances and that all disputes can and should be settled by peaceful means. The problem with this assertion is that it relies on unrealistic views about nature and human behavior. For people to become pacifist, they must believe there is an alternative to physical power as the basis for keeping people safe and secure against predators that is equally as capable of keeping people secure as physical power is, despite thousands of years of evidence that there isn't. Unfortunately, there does not appear to be a viable alternative to physical power with the same level of security needed to keep people secure against invaders and oppressors. When populations refuse to master the art of projecting physical power to secure themselves, the outcome is usually the same: mass graves dug by the pacifists themselves, people who are clearly willing to die without putting up a fight. Pacifists seek peaceful adjudication to all property or policy disputes. The problem with this approach is that peaceful adjudication requires a judge or a jury, people with abstract power appointed by an abstract power hierarchy, to make a judgment about the dispute. Peaceful adjudication therefore requires trusting a judge or jury to cast impartial or fair judgments. Note how the term fair in this context is subjective, thus incapable of impartiality from the start. Peaceful adjudication requires common consensus as well as trust in the people being judged to honor the outcome of their judgment. These all seem like good ideas in theory, but they rely on an unrealistic assumption that these conditionalities can and will be met, and that people are going to remain sympathetic to their verdict forever. As history makes abundantly clear, it's not possible for these conditions to be met all the time forever. Sooner or later, Timur or one of his many reincarnations are going to reappear. An impolite but simple argument to make against pacifism is that pacifists are self-domesticated animals who are unfit for survival in a world filled with predators. Pacifists forfeit their capacity and inclination to project physical power and to impose physical costs on others for abstract reasons, usually because of the energy it expends or the injury it causes. History makes it very clear what happens to pacifists. Their belief systems get psychologically exploited or their resources get physically captured or invaded. They get oppressed by corrupt, unimpeachable rulers, or they get steamrolled by unfriendly neighbors who don't subscribe to the same pacifist ideologies. We have thousands of years of detailed written testimony about this, but somehow people keep allowing themselves to forget the moral of the story. It could be argued that pacifism is what happens when people spend too much time with the friendly, docile, domesticated versions of themselves, or watch too many carefully edited videos of nature which have the unforgiving, brutal, and cruel parts, in other words, the mostly natural parts, filtered out. Pacifism is what happens when generations of people spend their entire lives outsourcing their physical security and predation to other people, so they don't have to experience the discomfort associated with these activities. They spend their lives without having to earn their food or their freedom of action, without having to kill the animals they eat or to kill the people who are unsympathetic to their desire to live comfortably with the property and policies they value. It should come as no surprise that these types of people can develop distorted points of view about reality. Pacifists are people who become spoiled by the spoils of war, oblivious to the reason why they can afford to forget about Timur. Successful populations can get so comfortable living their leisurely, sedentary, and domesticated lives that they gain the luxury of developing unchallenged, imaginary beliefs about the world. Worlds where people aren't actively capturing and securing access to everything using brute force physical power, and where pacifists themselves don't directly benefit from this behavior. Pacifists appear to live in an imaginary world that does not exist, one devoid of predators. Perhaps because they have little experiential knowledge of wild nature from the safety and comfort of their neatly structured, unharassed societies. By practically all written accounts, this world has never actually existed. Modern agrarian society appears to always have been physically fighting each other intermittently. It is incontrovertibly true that forfeiture of physical power makes a population physically powerless to defend themselves. Moreover, there are clear, causally inferable relationships between physical power projection and prosperity. Or conversely, there is a clear, causally inferable relationship between pacifism and mass graves. It is therefore just as easy to argue that warfare is justifiable in some cases, and that mastering the art of warfighting is just as morally imperative for society. History makes it clear that pacifism is a security hazard, so it could just as easily be argued that it's unethical for pacifists to motivate people to adopt pacifist ideologies which make them demonstrably insecure against predation. This same line of reasoning has been repeated many times throughout history. The lessons of history tell us why it is strategically crucial for populations not to allow themselves to believe that physical power competitions are bad for society, just because they use a lot of energy or because they risk injury. When pacifists morally condemn the use of physical power, they contribute to a systemic security hazard which commonly invites invasion or oppression. Predators feed on weakness. Oppressors benefit from the sanctimonious peer pressure of pacifists who condemn physical aggression. Oppressors want their population to be passive. Passive populations are physically docile, and their belief systems are easy to exploit. Again, this isn't dogma speaking. It is incontrovertibly true that docility leads directly to slaughter. We have more than 36 naturally randomized A/B testing experiments between wild and domesticated animals to causally infer a link between lack of physical aggression and systemic scale exploitation. There is a clear, causally inferable relationship between pacifism and exploitation upon which humans continuously take advantage of. It is a matter of fact that boars don't experience peace when they are selectively bred to be less physically powerful and aggressive. They experience being turned into bacon. Our civilization was built upon making animals docile and exploiting them at massive scale to plow our fields and fill our stomachs. Sapiens are animals too. It's unreasonable to believe we aren't equally vulnerable to the same threat. For whatever reason, people keep allowing themselves to forget the basic lesson of domestication, despite how often it reappears in history. The lesson is simple. Systemic exploitation and abuse is a byproduct of people who don't use physical power to settle their disputes, not a byproduct of people who do. Remove a population's capacity and inclination to impose severe physical costs on their neighbors, and they will face severe systemic security problems. If it's true for aurochs, boars, and junglefowl, then it's reasonable to expect it to be true for primates like sapiens too. A human population's aversion to physical aggression and their forfeiture of physical power is likely to be a direct contributing factor to insecurity. It could be possible that foreign invasion and the egregious levels of loss associated with wide-scale systemic exploitation by corrupt government officials is directly attributable to pacifism, to the people who don't project physical power to impose severe physical costs on those who attack or abuse them. That makes it just as easy to morally condemn people who aren't physically aggressive as it is to condemn people who are. At least the people who assert that physical power and aggression is good can back it with billions of years of empirical evidence. They can point to the animals which enjoy the highest levels of freedom and self-agency in the wild and note how mean and aggressive they are, how strong they are, how sharp their teeth and their nails are. That's probably not a coincidence. Americans attempted to peacefully declare independence via a piece of paper in 1776, but that independence wasn't formally acknowledged until thousands of British soldiers were slain over the following 7 years. Years after winning that fight, the Constitution was written. Our founding fathers were aware of the emergent benefits of physical power and also well acquainted with the threat of an overreaching and abusive government. They understood that people who allow themselves to forfeit their ability to project physical power for theological, philosophical, or ideological reasons are people who forfeit their own security. This is precisely why the U.S. Constitution has the Second Amendment. In conclusion, those who understand how domestication works can understand why pacifism is as easy to call an unethical and immoral bane to society as the warfighting it condemns. Villainizing the use of physical power, Watts, to impose severe physical costs on potential attackers is perhaps the worst strategic blunder a freedom-loving society could make. Pacifism causes populations to adopt the exact opposite strategy they need to remain safe and secure. They cause populations to become weak, complacent, docile, and unfit to survive in a congested, contested, competitive, and hostile environment filled with predators and entropy. Section 4.9.15. There's no excuse for failing to understand the importance of physical power projection. Your problem's not the problem. Your problem is your attitude about the problem. Captain Jack Sparrow. Narrator's note. Captain Jack Sparrow never actually said this. Many have claimed that physical power breeds oppression, but this section provides a counterargument that oppression is actually caused by the asymmetric application of physical power, rather than physical power in and of itself. It's not simply the fact that one side uses physical power on the other that's to blame for oppression. It's that one side is asymmetrically more capable of and willing to use physical power on the other side that's to blame for oppression. In other words, oppression occurs when one side uses physical power and the other one doesn't. This would imply that it's actually the lack of capability or willingness to utilize physical power that breeds oppression. To put it bluntly, oppression is what happens when people refuse to fight for what they value. Herein lies a counterargument about why it is not logical for the oppressed to blame the state of oppression on the physical strength and aggression of their oppressor. It's not reasonable for people to villainize the use of physical power to capture and secure resources, because this is simply how nature works. Look around and you will see that the strongest, sharpest, and most physically assertive creatures rise to the top of every food chain in practically every biome on Earth. For people to ignore their primordial roots and these basic lessons of nature and survivorship is not logical, it's ideological. The author asserts that this is what happens when people spend too much time separated from predators. They forget how survival works. The act of using physical power to settle disputes, establish pecking order, and secure resources preceded agrarian civilization by billions of years. Life has always behaved like this, since it was nothing but a thin film of organic material stretched across a volcanic rock, and there's simply no logical reason to believe that sapiens would be an exception to this behavior. The reasoning that people use to claim that the use of physical power is bad is ideological, not logical. But ideologies alone can't secure irrigated land, or protect society from neighboring societies who want to take that irrigated land back. Only physical power does that. If we were to factor basic lessons of nature and survivorship into our calculus, then one counterargument to people who claim that physical power and aggression is the root cause of oppression is that the oppressed should take accountability for their lack of physical power and aggression. It's irrational to expect sapiens to be exempt from the basic principles of survivorship that we can all independently observe and verify. Life has always been about survival of the fittest, about finding the best ways to project power and adapt. Our imaginations and our ideals don't change the laws of physics. As argued throughout this thesis, survival of the fittest didn't suddenly disappear when sapiens started using abstract thinking to form moral, ethical, or theological concepts. Sapiens are not exempt from life's rigorous natural selection process. We do not get to unsubscribe from primordial economics and the survivor's dilemma just because we happen to be capable of believing in imaginary alternative realities where physical power isn't the primary basis for settling our intraspecies disputes and establishing our dominance hierarchies. For the past 4 billion years, the universe has been consistently harsh and unsympathetic to organisms which don't find ways to project power in increasingly clever ways. If any organism is to survive and prosper in this environment, they must stay accountable to themselves and not allow themselves to stop projecting power. Sapiens are organisms. Like any other organism, They are responsible for developing increasingly clever ways to project power for the sake of survival and prosperity in a world teeming with predators and entropy. Since sapiens are peak predators, they especially must keep searching for increasingly clever power projection tactics, techniques, and technologies which maximize their ability to survive against themselves. These are stoic lessons which many military officers, like the author, have learned to accept. The blunt, logical reasoning goes something like this. Your opponent's strength may not be the only thing to blame for your losses. Your own physical weakness, incompetence, or complacency could just as easily be to blame for your losses. Your opponent's inclination to be physically aggressive may not be exclusively to blame for your losses. Your disinclination to be physically aggressive at appropriate times and places could just as easily be to blame for your losses. Your fear and aversion to using physical power could just as easily be to blame for your losses. Your trust in untrustworthy people or your reliance on imaginary power which doesn't physically defend you could just as easily be to blame for your losses. So if you don't want to experience losses or become oppressed, it stands to reason that you should consider taking responsibility for your own weakness, ignorance, and incompetence, rather than assigning the blame to other people. If you don't fight for what you value, then you will be devoured, like everything else is in nature. If you allow yourself to become physically weak, docile, and domesticated, then it stands to reason that you should expect to suffer the same fate as dozens of other animals which became physically weak, docile, and domesticated. If you fail to adapt to shared objective physical reality, then it is unreasonable for you to expect, or even more ridiculous, for you to believe that you deserve, a different outcome than countless other species who failed to adapt to physical reality over the past hundreds of millions of years. We can all independently observe how the world functions outside of that imaginary one we keep building inside of our heads. Proof of power is all around us. We can see and measure it everywhere. There is no shortage of evidence outside our homes, inside our history books, or on top of our dinner plates. There is simply no excuse for not recognizing the essential role that physical power plays for one's own security and prosperity, no matter how energy intensive it is, and no matter how much physical injury it risks. Incontrovertible proof of how essential physical power projection is for survival is present in practically every observable corner of our environment, at every size and scale. It doesn't make sense to expect nature to function differently for sapiens than for everything else. In shared objective physical reality, every decision, including and especially the decision not to project physical power, has material consequences, and nobody gets to unsubscribe from them.